So we're in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. That comes from the Greek word apocalypsis.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Revelation. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 11.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So you can see how it's possible to take this passage in chapter 11 and to take it out of context with some kind of symbolic spiritual explanation if you believed that God was really done with Israel and that Israel was never going to return to the land. But this passage of the temple, it's not talking about measuring the church. It's a simple explanation for this passage. And the simple explanation is that this is a real Jewish temple and that it's to be built in Jerusalem, but it just hasn't been built yet. And also this temple, it has to be built to be able to fulfill that prophecy that was written in Daniel chapter 9. And that's where the Antichrist, he will make a 7-year treaty with Israel by allowing them to build this temple. Then we know that the Antichrist will eventually, he'll break this covenant by placing the abomination of desolation in its holy place. And so doing this and being commanded to go measure this temple, it had to have been astonishing to John because it was only 25 years earlier that Titus Vespasian, that he destroyed that temple in Jerusalem. And Titus, he had destroyed that temple so completely that no one could ever really figure out where that temple had once really stood. And so now if you go and you look at the Temple Mount today, you don't see a Jewish temple there. All you see there is 2 Islamic mosques. You see the Dome of the Rock and you see the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they're both built around the 8th century. And the Jews, ever since the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD, and after they had been exiled from Israel, they never dreamed of rebuilding their temple. In fact, they never dreamed of ever being back in Israel as a nation. But after 1948 and the reestablishing of Israel as a nation, and then being back in the land, and then gaining control of the city of Jerusalem in 1967, there emerged a group of Jews who dedicated their lives to the rebuilding of the third temple. And this group is called the Temple Institute. And if you go there today, they will receive offerings from you toward their efforts. And they'll even take it from us evangelical Christians. And there's a lot of us Christians who will actually go and they'll donate to them. But what you have to realize is that this third temple, though it will be a Jewish temple, it's not God's temple. This is the temple that's built for the Antichrist. And it's the one that the Antichrist allows to be built by this treaty with the Jews. And although the Jews, they'll be allowed to begin their sacrifices again, these sacrifices, they will not be acceptable to God. They'll actually be an abomination to him. But for most of the citizens of Israel today, they look at these people from the Temple Institute as if they're all crazy. They look at them the same way we would look at like a cult. And the Orthodox Jews today, you know, they're not even on board with these works of the Temple Institute for rebuilding the third temple. But the Orthodox Jews, they do believe that a third temple will be rebuilt, but they don't believe it's going to be rebuilt by the Temple Institute. They believe that this temple is going to be rebuilt by the Messiah himself. And where they get their thinking and the scriptures that they're looking at Zechariah 6:12, where it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold the man whose name is the branch. From his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord." So these Orthodox Jews, they think that their Messiah is going to rebuild the temple. Now, if you went to an Orthodox Jew and you says, well, how are you going to know and how are you going to recognize your Messiah? Well, they don't go to the same prophecies that we go to about the Messiah, the things that we look at, that, well, he has to be a descendant of King David and he has to be born in Bethlehem, or those 300 messianic prophecies that are all written in the Old Testament. All they say is well, we'll know him because he'll allow us to rebuild our temple. And so their thinking is already totally set up for this deception of the Antichrist. And so when people look at this, and they look at it in just the natural sense, well, they'll say, well, there's still one problem. How could anybody build a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount without causing World War III or some type of holy war? Because the Muslims, they would never allow anything like this to occur. And the Muslim people, they've believed for centuries that these Arab mosques were built where the Jewish temple used to be, and they're not going to tear down their mosques. But there's a couple possibilities of how this could actually happen that have come to light just fairly recently. What it has to do with the location of the Eastern Gate. And where the Eastern Gate stands today, well, that's where the Dome of the Rock now stands, and that's where it's built. But this may not be the location of the original Eastern Gate, because in recent years, it's been discovered that there is these excavations underneath the Temple Mount that they believe that they found the original Eastern Gate, and it's a little bit further north, and that it's been buried there under the Temple Mount since Titus. And when that gate was found, the Arabs, they stopped allowing any excavation to be able to go on under the Temple Mount. But what this means is that it's actually possible to have a Jewish temple in its original place without upsetting the two mosques that are currently standing on the Temple Mount. And the reason why that's possible is because the original Jewish temple, Solomon's temple, it wasn't that big. When we look at the temple and you see pictures of the temple, and what we see when they show these pictures, we see Herod's temple. And Herod's temple is this elaborate, huge temple. But the original Solomon's temple was only 2,700 square feet big. So it's the size of a medium to large home. And it had the proportions of basically an enlarged shoebox. It was just a rectangle. And so they believe that this temple, that this could be built in its original location without affecting any of the other mosques. And it's kind of like what the scriptures are saying here, where it says to measure the temple and the altar, but leaving those outside courts to the Gentiles. So this could be talking about those Muslims' mosques. And then it says that these Gentiles will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And 42 months is 3.5 years. So this is for half of the 7-year tribulation period, where they will have control of this area of the Temple Mount. But then it says that the angel will give his 2 witnesses his power, and that they will prophesy for 1,260 days, which is also about 3.5 years. It's actually 3.452 years, but I would say that that's probably close enough. And I think they figure that out, that would be with a 360-day calendar, like they used to have while they measured things in the Old Testament. So what my best guess of what's happening here is that these 2 witnesses, well, they're going to be at this Jewish temple that's been rebuilt in Jerusalem for the first 3.5 years. So they're going to be there for the first 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation period. And so this will be right after it's been built by the Jews, after the Antichrist has given them the authority to rebuild this temple. Okay, so now you got all the sacrifices going on. And so you got Jews coming from all over the world. The Jews are happy. And for a while, you didn't have the Antichrist, he's happy. But there's only one problem here, that they got these 2 guys outside the temple, and they're saying, well, this temple is not pleasing to God. And both these guys are testifying to Jesus Christ. And they're saying, well, he's the real sacrifice, and that all their sacrifices that they're making, that they're no good. And they're telling these people, well, this is all just a trap from the devil, and how this isn't really God's temple, but that this is the Antichrist temple, and that the Spirit of God, well, he's not in this temple. And that's because the Spirit of God is actually in those 2 witnesses that are standing outside of the temple. And so the Jews, they hate it, and the Antichrist, He hates it, but there's absolutely nothing they can do about it because God, he has given his power to these two witnesses to speak his word, but he's also given them his power. And he's given us power to do all these signs, to be able to call fire down, to stop the rain, to turn the water into blood, and to cause all these plagues. And they can do it as often as they wish. And so these two guys, they're untouchable. And anybody who tries to touch them or harm them, they're killed. And they're killed by fire. And so anyone who attacks these two witnesses, it really just comes back on their own heads. Because these witnesses, they don't just come in words, but they come in power. But you can't assume that these two witnesses, that they don't have a heart for these Jewish people, that they're just callously, calling down these plagues on the world, because that wouldn't be true. These two witnesses, they have God's heart in this manner, where they care for these people. And the way you can see that they care for these people is because you can see they're mourning for these people. And the reason that we know that they're mourning for these people is because they're wearing sackcloth, which is the clothes of mourning. And so that's what people wear when they're in great sorrow, which means they're basically wearing these burlap sacks. And this was the common dress for the prophets, the ones who delivered God's message when there was impending judgment on Israel. And these two witnesses, what their purpose is and what they're hoping for is that some of these Jews will hear them and they will repent and believe in God and they'll receive as Christ. And they hope this even as the whole world hurls abuse at them and makes all these violent attempts to stop their witness by killing them. Okay, so now the question here is always, well, who are these two witnesses? Are they the Cape Crusaders? Is this Batman and Robin? Or is this the two of the X-Men? Because these guys, they do have superpowers. But the question we have is, who do we think they are? Well, there's a couple clues in the Bible, but nobody knows for sure. For some people, they believe that it's one of the prophets of the past, but it doesn't say that it has to be. It could be someone from the modern era. But the people who do think it's these prophets from the past, some think it's these two people, Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, that come from the book of Zechariah in chapter 4. And the reason they think it could be Zerubbabel and Joshua is because of this imagery of them being called the two olive trees and the two lampstands, which is mentioned here in Revelation 11:4. Because in the book of Zechariah, when these two men, Zerubbabel and Joshua, when they were rebuilding this temple, which was a totally impossible job, God had called the word to these men his two olive trees. He didn't really call them his two olive trees, but he called the word to these men, where God told them in verse 6 in Zechariah, it says, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord hosts." But for all we know, it could be these two guys, and he might be calling them his olive trees, but he never calls them his two lampstands in Zechariah. All right, but what I think it could be, what the Lord is doing here, is he's saying that these two witnesses, they're going to be empowered like these two guys, Zerubbabel and Joshua, that these two guys will be upheld in strength that's beyond them, that it will only be done by his spirit. It won't be by their might or their power, but that it's going to be by his spirit. And so it's only a small percentage of Christians who actually believe it's Zerubbabel and Joshua. But most Christians will agree that one of these witnesses they believe is Elijah, that he will be one of these two witnesses. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is found in Malachi 4:5, which is that last book in our Old Testament, where it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers." And then Jesus, he also confirmed that Elijah would come first. And he said it in Mark chapter 9:12, and he said it also in Matthew 7:11. And they also believe that it could be Elijah, or it will be Elijah, because of the signs that these witnesses do, where there's this shutting up of the heavens from rain. Well, that's an Elijah miracle. That's an Elijah miracle from 1 Kings. And then there's this calling fire from heaven to consume those who attack him. Well, Elijah did that in 2 Kings 1:10. And then there's this whole part of Elijah never dying, where Elijah, he didn't die a natural death, where Elijah was taken up in a fiery chariot while he was still alive. And then people will quote Hebrews chapter 9:27, where it says that it's appointed for men to die once. So some people think that Elijah, he's going to have to come back and he's going to have to die once, which leads us to what some people's choice for the second witness is. And their second witness, they would say, is Enoch, because in Genesis 5:21, we're told that Enoch, that he didn't die either. And it says in 5:24 of Genesis, it says, Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. So Enoch too, he was raptured, or he was what they called translated. And though there's a lot of people who believe that these two witnesses will be Elijah and Enoch, and it's because they didn't die natural deaths. But for those people who don't believe it will be Enoch, they tend to believe that the other witness will be Moses. And that's because of the type of miracles that are here in the plagues that these witnesses perform, and where they can do it as often as they wish. Those are those things like turning water into blood and striking the earth with all these plagues. And that's exactly what Moses did in Egypt. And you do see both of these men, Elijah and Moses, you see them both speaking with Jesus at his transfiguration. And you do see there that whatever type of body Elijah had there, well, Moses, he had the same type of body there too. And then there's this really interesting comment that you can read in the book of Jude in verse 9, where it says that there was this dispute over Moses's body between Michael the archangel and the devil. And so I kind of think it kind of goes along what it says about Elijah in Malachi, where it says to turn the children's heart back to their fathers and the father's heart back to the children, that who would not be better to turn their hearts back to the God, where Moses, he actually represented God to the children of Israel. And then they'll say that Elijah, he represents, the prophets, and Moses, that he represents the law. Okay, so this is what I believe happens, that they do this for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, where they're standing outside the temple doors and they're ministering to these Jews that are coming from all over the world to sacrifice at this new temple. And then we're told in verse 7, when they finish their testimony, and so when their job is finished, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them and overcome them and kill them. All right, so here we have the first mention of the beast, and that's the same person who we call the Antichrist. And the name, the beast, it will be mentioned, and we'll read 36 times in the book of Revelation. And this beast, he is not allowed to kill these two witnesses until they're finished with their ministries. Because until they're finished, these two men are untouchable and nothing can stop them. But God, he's not going to leave him on this earth any longer than he has to. Because you have to realize, these guys, their job is really hard. And they're pretty much alone, and they're against the whole world. And I kind of believe it's kind of the same way for us, that until God is finished with us, until we have finished our ministries in serving the Lord, the world, they can't really hurt us. That in a way, we're also untouchable. And so now, when this beast comes against them and kills them, the world, they think the beast is a hero. And they think that he's won. And it'll be just like what they're going to sing over in Revelation 13:4. They'll be singing, who is like the beast and who is able to make war with him? Oh, he won. He's our hero. And so the whole world, they're rejoicing over the killing of these two prophets of God because they hated him so much. And because of that, they won't even give him a proper burial. And in Israel, among the Jews and the Arabs, they always bury a body the same day that a person dies. They do it within 24 hours, and because that's a sign of respect. But they dishonor these men so badly, they just leave their bodies there on the street. And they leave them there laying and rotting for these 3.5 days. And this is the only place in Revelation where you see any rejoicing on the earth or anywhere during this whole 7-year period. And all of this is happening in downtown Jerusalem. And the reason we know it's Jerusalem is because we're told it's where the Lord was crucified. But here, Jerusalem, it's been given a new name. And its new name is Sodom, which means that these people, they are perverted, immoral people. And then it calls them Egypt, which means they're full of idolatry and oppression and slavery. And so for that whole 3.5 days, their bodies are laying there. and the whole world is watching. And it's not just the Jews watching in Jerusalem, but it's the whole world, all the nations, because these witnesses, they were hated by everyone. And the reason is because the world hates God and the world hates his Christ. And so they also hate his witnesses. And just to let you know and to be clear, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, they also hate you. And the world here is just so happy because the world, they're blaming these two men for all their torment because of all of their own disobedience and their rebellion against God. And so now they start this new holiday, and everybody's sending gifts to each other. And this holiday, it's bigger than Christmas. And all of the religions, they join in it because this is very exciting. And I don't know what they call it, but it's kind of Kill a Prophet Day. And they're all so in love with the beast here. He is their hero. And so the whole world, they're sitting there and they're watching this on their iPhones. And some of you are watching it on your Androids. And they're traveling from all over the world just to get that selfie picture with the dead bodies in the background. And as the whole world is watching, the breath of life from God enters them. And then they stand up on their feet. And then the whole world goes from having this great joy to great fear and being absolutely terrified. And then they hear this voice that says, "Come up here." And it looks just like Jesus when he ascended to heaven. They're going up into this cloud. And I'm going to guess that it's going to be the same way when the rapture comes, that we'll hear that same "come up here," because that's the same words that John heard in chapter 4, "come up here." And so now the world's going to be thinking, oh no, it's happening again. And now they're going to be remembering when all those Christians disappeared from the world. And they see that these men who have been testifying about the same Jesus that all the Christians talked about, and now they're coming to life and they're being raptured right in front of them. And now the whole world, they find themselves on the wrong side of God again and being an enemy to the only real God. But for them to have fear, it's a good thing because this fear can help them to change their minds. So this is a wake-up call. And I believe that the witness of these two prophets was very, very profitable because right after this scene is when I believe the Antichrist, he goes into that temple and he demands to be worshiped God. And that it's because of these two witnesses, and because he's been witnessing to all these Jews in Jerusalem, that they finally figure out that they have been deceived by this Antichrist. And now they know where to flee because they're gonna know all the things that have been written in Matthew 24 to not go down and get your coat. Just get out of here. Just go. And then after these two witnesses are ascended, there is this earthquake. And you see that there's 1/10 of the city of Jerusalem is destroyed and 7,000 are killed. And so even in this, you see that God has his great mercy, that it's only 1/10 of the city. It's not the whole city being destroyed. And only 7,000 die. It's not everyone. And we don't know who these 7,000 are. Maybe they were people that were trying to kill those prophets or work for the Antichrist. We don't know. But now you see that the whole world, they grudgingly give glory to the God of heaven because they all know that this is from God. And so now we end with the second woe has passed. And so next week, we're going to start the third woe, which is the blowing of the 7 trumpets.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, you can still make it to church today. And join us at 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,